So in this video, I'd like to talk about rendering and cameras. And before I do that, I want to just call your attention to this data being displayed here in the viewport, which I didn't necessarily explain and it just popped up in the last video, maybe the one previously. And what this is, actually in your viewport, you're able to display different types of data by going to display, heads up display. And this one in particular is poly count. This is what I had checked on. And poly count is useful so that you can see in your scene how many components you have in your scene, or you can see for just specific objects here how many components, so how many faces make up this one object, how many vertices make up this object. And so when you're trying to create a model that has, to create a model or a scene that maintains a certain level of complexity that won't like overburden your processor with either rendering, or particularly if you are thinking about making assets for a game, let's say later on, if you take Maya a little bit further and start making video game assets, you're going to want to be aware of just how many components make up your, how complex your models are. So I'm going to go ahead and actually turn this off because we don't necessarily need it for this assignment. What I've created here actually in the scene also, let me just describe it, is I'm just starting to create some kind of abstracted shapes. This I just used a cube and I went to edit and duplicate special, and I changed some parameters here in the options menu by translating it a different distance in each axis direction, and then rotating it 10 degrees over each iteration, and then also scaling it up over each iteration. Once I finished duplicating that one object, and I did it I think 36 times, I brought this back down to 1. So I did this a number of times, and then I went up again to mesh and combine, and I combined this all into one object, and then I deleted all the transform nodes by going to edit, delete all by type and history. And then I took that object, I duplicated it again, and I rotated it. So I have two sets of objects here that are starting to just play with form in a kind of abstracted and repetitive kind of form, and I'm making some kind of interesting shapes with that. So for this assignment, we're going to be rendering out JPEG images from Maya. So we're not saving the Maya file and submitting that. You're going to be rendering out, and whether you are, if you're, there are kind of two avenues that you take for Maya. So you're either going to be rapid prototyping 3D objects, or you're going to be creating video game assets, in which case the models themselves are what you will be exporting. Okay, we'll get into that in the next week's assignment. Or if you're creating animations from Maya, you're going to be rendering out JPEG image sequences. And in this case, for this project, we're going to be rendering out single frames. So you can think of them like a two-dimensional work of art that you're creating out of this three-dimensional program and three-dimensional space. So to begin, I want to talk about rendering and what our render settings are going to be, how to set them. So I have here these icons here, which will get me to my renderer. This one with a little gear brings me to my render settings. So let me click this. And Maya has a couple standard default renderers, the Maya software renderer, Maya hardware renderer. Those are really fast processing renderers, and the quality of the render is not very good. You'll get a kind of pixelated edges, hard pixelated edges around objects. But they're very fast processing, so they're maybe useful for something. But we want to work with the Arnold renderer. Arnold is new to Maya 2018, and it's Maya's like photorealistic renderer. And so if I make sure that under render using, I'm using the Arnold renderer. And you can see actually that we have a number of different tabs that come up depending on which renderer we're working in. And so under Arnold, there's a number of specifications we can set here under the Arnold renderer tab that we're going to get into a little bit later. But you just want to make sure that you're render using Arnold. When we go to this common tab where it says file output here, this is where you're going to be setting the type of file that you are rendering out. And so the first thing to do is we have file name prefix. So you can save your scene as, or you can, I'm sorry, save your exported file as a particular name. So you can either, it will either save it as whatever you're saving your scene name as, or you can change it to, you know, maybe project one first export or something like this, whatever you want to name it here. More importantly, we have the image format, and we want to change this to JPEG, okay, at the very bottom. We're going to leave the quality at 100, and we are just using this right here, frame animation extension. We are just using a single frame. So what this is telling us is that we are going to be rendering this out and saving this image as whatever my file name is, .jpg. Next, I'm going to go down to where it says renderable cameras. And this is something we're going to get into later, which is creating cameras in your scene. But for now, let me say that the perspective view that we're looking at in the viewport is actually a camera itself, just like we have the orthographic views are also cameras. And so when I'm orbiting around my viewport or panning or zooming, I'm actually moving the perspective camera in the space. And so what we're going to want to do is create a new camera that stays fixed so that we're still able to use so the perspective view can basically be freed up, so you're still able to use the perspective view to be able to navigate through your scene and still manipulate and change things while keeping the camera that you plan to render to or render from, keeping that separate so that you can continue to kind of move around the space in the perspective view, and then you'll have your camera from which you'll render from. So here is where you're going to be setting what that renderable camera is. And then below that, under image size, we are going to want to be saving this at HD 720. So this is a nice kind of, I don't care, the resolution size at 72 is just fine. Just know that if you ever wanted to print something, you'd want it to be at least 300 pixels per inch, because a printer is around 300 dots per inch. So that gives you a really nice kind of crisp and clear image. We can do different size units here, but this preset HD 720, just so that you're aware, you can change the size to be, let's say, inches, and now this tells you what this will print out to be, 17 by 10 inches. So it's kind of a medium size image. But go back to pixels here, and this is the kind of settings that we want to be rendering our three abstracted images to, okay? And so that is kind of it for now for the render settings. Eventually we're going to be changing this to camera one, okay? Close out of here. So now let me go ahead and create a camera, and I can do so going under the create menu to camera. And here I have three different types of cameras. I have just a camera object. I have what's called a camera and aim, which gives me a camera and also attaches it. It constrains it to an aim, which is a kind of target. It's a null object that acts as a target, so that when you move the aim, the camera always follows where that aim is. And then we also have a camera aim and up. And this gives us a camera and an aim, and it also allows us to tilt the camera up and down. So I'm just going to create a camera in the scene. Another way I can create a camera is actually under my rendering tab here. Sorry. Under my rendering tab on the shelf, I can create a basic camera by clicking this icon. But let me go ahead and create a camera. And now you see it's actually all the way down here. This is a fairly large scene that I've made, and it's all the way down here at the origin of the grid. And but in my outliner, you'll see that I have this new object, this camera object that's just been created in the scene. So with my camera kind of down here, I have my scale tool selected, so I can actually scale up this camera so I can actually see it in the scene. This doesn't necessarily change any of the camera settings. It just makes its icon in the viewport easier to see, depending on the size of your scene. And what I can do, if I go here to like let's just look at this through my 2-panel layout. And I'm going to keep this as perspective, but in this panel here, if I go up to panels, and I can do this in my single panel too, but I'm going to do it so that I'm still able to see my perspective view, but now I'm also able to see my camera view. And I'm going to go up to panels, and I'm going to, under perspective, I'm going to choose this new camera that I've just created. Okay. The other way I can do this is by having my camera selected. I can click on look through selected. And so now I have my camera 1 is selected, and actually it looks like I'm kind of my camera 1's inside an object. So I can move this camera just as I would move, my camera move the perspective camera, and I can do that by using my camera 1 viewport here and by toggling and rotating and zooming out. And so you can see now my perspective view that my camera is moving in the space. Okay, so I can go ahead and also move it manually using my perspective view if I'd like. Or I'm able to navigate by looking through the camera. Okay. So now what I could do, if I have my camera, ideally I would be, maybe placing objects in the scene and then coming up with a kind of composition through looking through my camera that I find interesting. And then maybe I'm going to lock my camera in place just so it's not selectable, just like I did with my layers. But before I do that, actually, let me go ahead and talk about something else with your camera. If you remember, when we went to our render settings, we set a particular aspect ratio to our camera, which was 1280 pixels by 720 pixels. And so my viewport here is not at that same aspect ratio. It's just filling up kind of whatever available screen space I have in my interface. The size and the ratio of this camera will change. Let's say if I collapse these two down, now I have more of kind of like a square ratio image. But I'm going to just zoom in a little bit. But I would actually like to be able to see what will render out, just so while I'm deciding on my compositions, I'm able to kind of see what the parameters or what the kind of area that's renderable will be. So if I go under View here, I can go down to Camera Settings and I can turn on Resolution Gate. And what that does is it grays out anything that won't be rendered and keeps in view what will be rendered. And so this is a really nice way for me to now kind of decide what kind of composition I want here. What kind of two-dimensional image do I want to create using my three-dimensional objects? A couple other things about cameras is we can change a number of parameters under the attribute editor for my camera. And you see here that now we can see what we're looking at here. Let me go back to my single panel view and let me go Okay, I think my Maya's going to crash, so um, let me come back in a second.